Well, you know what? If I get that prediction right, you all have to watch a video I make that isn't about FNAF.
Ladies, gentlemen, and those with the good sense to do away with the whole notion, I welcome you to the premier audio medium for all your Fazbear entertainment needs. The Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast. Note, FFPP is not responsible for any loss of appetite, disinterest, dismemberment, or other legally classified statuses. So strap in and enjoy.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast. I'm your host, the Toast Rytos, to talk about Five Nights at Freddy's, like we always do. A bit of a housekeeping update, but this Friday's video will be the first main channel video not edited by myself. It's a big step for the channel, something I've been really excited and scared to do, but I really trust the editors that I'm bringing on, and hoping that it will give me more time to do more other stuff. I know a lot of you have noticed that the second channel and third channel are basically dead, and that's because editing the main channel takes up all my time, and I have not had time to make content for those channels. So I'm hoping that, in this process, I can start to do more of the second and third channel stuff and really ramp production back up. But, it's going to be the same style, just frankly edited better than I can. Not every single video is going to be not me. I'm still kind of easing into it, but yeah. Anyway, this first week's video, all the editors will be credited in the description. This first week's video is edited by Kate Okado, friend of the channel. So, get ready for that, be excited. Anyway, enough of the housekeeping. Let's get to the main topic, because apparently a FNAF sequel is on the way. For those of you who were not watching or did not see Twitter after it happened, but in Dawko's recent charity live stream, Scott was in the chat for a bit. And there's two real chat messages that stick out to me. One of them real brief, and we'll save it for when I can dedicate a full podcast to it, maybe even with a guest or two. The first one that sticks out is Chica's Secret Party, the not real game that's in the most recent guidebook. Basically there's like 4 or 5 pages dedicated to this Flash game that apparently was on Scott Games and nobody found. I don't think it's real, frankly. Maybe it's a troll, maybe it's an ARG, I don't know, but it is insane. But Dawko asked Scott about it, and he basically said like, sorry, what was that? Anyway, I gotta go. Like, he definitely did not want to talk about it, which either to me, it is a troll and that's just him responding to a troll, or it was a really somehow massive mistake on a guidebook and he just doesn't want to talk about it. To me, it feels like more of a troll or ARG response, because if it was this huge mistake, I feel like we would have heard from Scott about it at this point. It's not just like, oh, they got a name wrong. There's 4 pages dedicated to a game that doesn't exist. So like, how? Because there's screenshots too. So either, I think either this is real and we just never found it, which I highly doubt. To troll, maybe it's a setup for something coming down the line. Maybe it's an ARG. Maybe it came out too early and something coming down soon. I don't know. But to assume that it's this massive 4 or 5 page mistake, I think that's a big assumption to make. Because again, like I said, there's screenshots. So either somebody would have had to, on the team, been manually photoshopping these screenshots together, or, somebody would have to assume that like they AI'd the whole guidebook and cleaned it up in post, and AI just like hallucinated something. But frankly, AI is like worthless, and I highly doubt that the rest of the book would be generally accurate, and then there'd be 5 pages of completely made up nonsense. And people check these books. So and if it was AI, I'm sure Scott would have words about it, because I know, he's made it very clear he fucking hates AI. So, generative AI is worthless and actively harmful to the environment and the minds of people. So, Scott has a very similar opinion on that. So I highly doubt, unless it's a matter of just like, he's looking into it to see if that is the issue. I don't know. But again, I don't think it's a mistake. And I think his response of, what was that? Anyway, gotta go. To me, he said that about a lot of trolls in the past. So we'll see. But like I said, I want to dedicate a whole episode to digging into what that could possibly be. It's the other thing he said that I think is really interesting. And that's when Doc was asking about, like, is there anything going on? Is there anything down the line? Because it's a good question to ask. A lot of FNAF fans, myself included, are kind of in that moment where we're like, hey, what's going on? Like, when's the next anything? And it's not for lack of release schedule. We've been getting really good scheduled releases, right? Like last year we got Secret of the Mimic. The year before was Into the Pit. It was Help Wanted 2. Like we had a lot. We've been getting back-to-back releases. We got the FNAF 2 movie in December. We have a graphic novel coming out soon for some of the Tales of the Pizza Black stories. We have a good schedule of releases. But as far as like games go, it's been a while since we've had no news like we do right now. I can remember the first like year or so after Security Breach was pretty quiet, but even then there was at least like rumors of things coming out, and a couple years later it was like, okay, now we're getting like word about a possible DLC, or like we were getting some kind of teasers for something, and we just don't right now. It's interesting. We really don't have teasers for anything. The closest we have, and I made a couple videos on this, is the posts that Leon Riskin, frequent composer for Five Nights at Freddy's games, pretty much the main composer for FNAF games, that's just not the main thing he does, he was posting somewhat FNAF related teasers that was getting a lot of attention, and I covered them on the channel, and that was like, it was good crumbs, but like it would be cool if we had something tangible. And again, I'm not saying we need a game soon, because it hasn't even been a year since Secret of the Mimic. I'm greedy, but I'm not that greedy. But it would be nice to know like a teaser or some like kind of, hey, we're working on something, especially since like there was a huge gap between Security Breach and I guess next would have been Ruin, right? It would have been Ruin, then Help Wanted 2, if I'm remembering correctly. And that was a huge gap. And I understand like these games are big and they take time now. But not only has Steel Wool made it clear like we have a bigger team, and we are now that we're used to this workflow, we are working on multiple things at once. So that shortens down time in between games. It's just that like not only do we have that fact, so like it could be coming out within the next couple years, who knows, but even if it's a year or 2 years out, the idea of some kind of teaser of just like we are working on something, just to confirm that there's something going on next, would be enough to satiate a lot of us, I think. Just to be like, yeah, we all really care about this franchise. We just want to make sure that like we're not waiting for 4 years for anything to happen to it. So, a very understandable question, like what is next? Like, are you guys working on anything? That kind of question was being brought up. And Scott, and I want to quote this directly, so I should have pulled it up previously. I didn't. Let me pull it up right now. Yeah, the quote directly was, "There is a sequel to something being worked on, by the way. Not a 3, semicolon, a 2. Which is really interesting. And honestly, that is enough to work with. Because we have to think about what games make sense to be a sequel? Not a 3, a 2. Frankly, I don't think it would be any of the first 7. Ultimate Custom Night 2. I mean, maybe Ultimate Custom Night 2. It's possible. But I feel like Ultimate Custom Night makes more sense after a plot has resolved. And plots have not resolved yet. We're still in the rising action to the climax of the Mimic arc. I've talked about this a few times on the channel, that like breaking down the current storyline of FNAF, we are at the end of the rising action, which implies that the next game is the big game. And what I mean by that is, each of these games obviously have their own internal stories. Security Breach has, rising action of going through the game, learning what's going on at the place. All of this, the climax then being either going against Burntrap or escaping. I would argue the Burntrap fight is the climax. And then the resolution being whatever ending you pick. So that's Security Breach's story. Then we have Help Wanted and Help Wanted 2's. Help Wanted came out first, but their stories are a bit more loose because it's more of a minigame collection with loose story added to it. But there is a story there. With Help Wanted, we have the collection of the tapes as the rising action, the climax being picking your ending, and the resolution being the ending you've picked. And even internally, Pizza Party is the climax of Help Wanted. And then Help Wanted 2, we have further learning the environment, unlocking taking off the mask, the Faz wrench, that's your rising action. Your climax being your face off against either Circus Baby or Vanny, depending on what ending you've chosen. Resolution being the ending after. Secret of the Mimic, same story, or same deal with Secret of the Mimic. The rising action is encountering the Mimic so many times. The climax of that story, I think, begins at the pizzeria and ends once you leave leave MCM, and then the resolution being the ending you've chosen. They all have their stories. But as far as the story of the Mimic, which I think does start at Help Wanted, we are at the end of the rising action. You have Help Wanted, you have Security Breach, Ruin, Help Wanted 2, Secret of the Mimic. These 5 pieces of work, right? Ruin is a DLC, so I can't say 5 individual games. But these 5 pieces of media are the rising action for the Mimic storyline. We have Help Wanted, which is mostly, referring to the past. It's a celebration, it's a collection. But there are undertones of the Mimic's story throughout the entire thing. Mainly through Glitch Trap, which seems to be this Mimic entity. This thing that is copying the things around it, learning from its environment, replicating its environment. So we get the undercurrents of the Mimic, which it serves really good as the first, prologue to this Mimic era, where it's all this FNAF merchandise and then something lurking throughout all of it. And then we have Security Breach, which, again, when Help Wanted 1 and Security Breach came out, we didn't really have a clue of what the Mimic was. We all had this idea of like the Afton virus, and we weren't really sure what was going on. But in retrospect, these games make a lot more sense as rising action for the Mimic, because you go through Security Breach and that everything of that is the Mimic. The Glam Rocks seem to be built off of Mimic technology. Obviously, the Glitch Trap, the Mimic systems are still throughout the Pizzaplex. We don't know it at the time, but there's a Mimic endoskeleton stuck down there, like there's a lot of this and the whole point of it was Vanny and likely Gregory were working to free the Mimic or do something with it under the behest of Glitch Trap. And then we have Ruin, which is showing us the aftermath of everything that's happened and the fact that the Mimic is now freed. And it's really important there that's when Ruin comes out. Because very common way to tell your story is you do rising action until your main villain rears his head. And then you backstory the villain so we know our stakes. And that's what happens. We've backstory the protagonist and the antagonist and that to me, that's the sign that the rising action is ending. That's the sign that we're about to see the climax, because we have, like I said, rising action where we get the undertones of the Mimic and what's going on. We get to see in front of us the problem happening, the people that are dying, something is wrong here. And then we get Ruin and Help Wanted 2, which to me is showing, we get Ruin, which is this cross gap of things have gone wrong, the Mimic is free. And then we get Help Wanted 2 and Secret of the Mimic. Help Wanted 2, I believe, is our protagonist's backstory. It's not to say that the protagonist of Help Wanted 2 is the protagonist. I think he is the backstory, because I think Help Wanted 2's protagonist is Cassie's dad. I think it makes a lot of sense. A lot of people agree with that. But because of that, I do think that Cassie... Scratch what I've just said. We're going with my theory that I keep saying, and that's that the main villain of the next game is Cassie and the Mimic. Because I think Security Breach is not only our rising action, but it's our introduction and backstory for our protagonist, which is Gregory, Vanessa, and Glamrock Freddy. We're doing a hero's journey, baby. We start with Help Wanted, which is our backstory for Vanessa and our beginning of the rising action of the Mimic. Then we get to Security Breach, where we get the continuation of Vanessa's story, the introduction of Gregory, the introduction of Glamrock Freddy, and the continuation of the Mimic's backstory, And then we get Ruin, which is introducing our 2 main villains, the Mimic and the girl he's kidnapped, Cassie. The girl he's brainwashed, Cassie. The new Vanessa. And, this is the reason this game had to have come out after Help Wanted, is because Help Wanted is the game that establishes, hey, these minds can be taken over by the Mimic. Vanessa was taken over by the Mimic. We see it in Security Breach. We see how it happens. We see what happens when that occurs, a villain. And then we get introduced to the Mimic and a girl that he kidnaps, right? So now we have Cassie and the Mimic Who are these characters? Why should we care about them? Now we get the 2 backstories because we get games about their creators. In a way, we get games about the people who created our villains. We get the game of Help Wanted 2, which is, I believe, about Cassie's dad and what he was going through trying to save the Pizzaplex. And in doing so, how he created Cassie. Not just being her literal father, but the fact that, looking into this while not telling Cassie about what's going on and then dying, leaving her alone, is the main reason why she ends up at the Pizzaplex and ends up getting her mind taken over. I mean, it's implied that it's his mask that she's putting on, because we see at the end of the game, in one of the endings, he gets killed by what he was trying to beat, and then his last vision is handing a Vanny mask very similar to the one he'd been using the entire game. So it seems incredibly likely that it's his mask. It's his fault that Cassie's being turned into a villain. And then we get our main actual, the cause of the villainy, which is the Mimic's backstory in Secret of the Mimic, a game about Edwin, Murray's costume manor, his inventions, his failures, and his latest creation, the Mimic. You see why I feel like the climax is next. Because we've had 2 games to establish our protagonists, 2 games to establish our protagonists, a game to establish the main issue, the Mimic is loose, and 2 games to establish our villains. We have all of our backstory, we have our setting, we have our problem. Now we just need the climax. We need Gregory, Vanessa, Glamrock Freddy to stop Cassie and the Mimic. I think that is what the next game is. Whether or not directly, I don't know, because we're in new ground here. When it comes to the original FNAF's run of 1 through 7, those games were interesting in the sense that they were never the main story. I think the closest to the main story was Sister Location in 6. But FNAF 1 through 4, including FNAF World, were, in a way, the main plot wasn't the games. I've said this before on the channel. What I mean to say is that the games are likely Michael Afton scrambling to find his father, but that's because the story of the games is the backdrop. It's William Afton and the MCI and the experiments and all that, and that's not what we're playing through. That's what we're dealing with. Whereas in the new era of FNAF, Help Wanted onward, it does feel like we're dealing with the main plot. What we're doing in the games is the main story. And that's not to say one is better or worse, but I think that's why, even though it felt really confusing around Security Breach, at this point in the game's franchise, I think the plot line is very clear. I think the story is very clear. It is, we are doing the story of the games. For the most part, there's still obviously things happening in the background. There's, Vanessa's whole thing about being Vanny and what she did as Vanny, that's in the background. But as far as stopping the Mimic, that does seem like the main thing we're doing. And frankly, what I'm trying to say is I feel like the next game is the Mimic's FNAF 6. I feel like the next game has to be taking on the Mimic full on and defeating it. Because every game up until this point since Help Wanted has been establishing characters and establishing problems. But they've all been established. It's time to take down the Mimic. So, a climax feels likely for our next game. So then we wrap back to the next game is a sequel. A 2, not a 3. Huh? So what does this eliminate? This eliminates Help Wanted 3, which I don't think anyone was expecting a Help Wanted 3, but it's fair to clarify that because, if we're just looking at main game releases, it's been Help Wanted, Security Breach, Help Wanted 2, Secret of the Mimic. So the idea that Help Wanted is between every main game, some people might get that wrong idea. I don't think that's true. I don't know how you would think that's true, because, to be honest, we'd run out of mini games. Just looking at the density, it's a miracle Help Wanted 1 and 2 worked. But the main reason it worked is because Help Wanted 1 was just the first 4.5 games. So they were able to pull on Sister Location 6, a lot of Security Breach, They were able to pull from that. And even then they had to make up completely new stuff, which led into the next game. So obviously Help Wanted 3 is basically being deconfirmed. So don't worry about it. It's not happening. In a way, we're also... I don't know what else I think Not a 3 only knocks out Help Wanted 3. I can't are there any other sequels that could have been a 3? I don't think so, right? Or so it's a 2. Then we got to look at like, what are we getting? Like I've said, a 2 of any of the original 7 games I think is unlikely. Not only because it's clunky. Like, what do we yeah. Let's release FNAF 4 2. Huh? That seems strange. Now, it is a sequel, so it's not necessarily saying 2 is in the title. So it could always be like FNAF 4 Requiem, FNAF 4 The Nightmare or something. Like there are ways to do stuff like that. But more than the clunkiness of the title, because the reason I explained that I think we're in the climax of the story is to say that I think pulling anything outside of the Mimic timeline would distract from that. If we're about to see the climax of the Mimic and then suddenly it's FNAF 3 2 and we just wanted to play that one again, but like a sequel, kind of pulls the rug right out from under us. There is one exception. There's one exception, that's FNAF's sister location 2. One, it's not FNAF 5 like the others are. It's FNAF's sister location. So FNAF sister location 2, it's less clunky. But 2, it does seem more and more likely with the Leon Riskin teasers that Cassie not only survived the elevator fall, but then had to, deal with what's down there, which what's down there seems more and more likely to be sister location if the, what we already suspected piled on with what we learned about the layout of the area from Secret of the Mimic. All of that combined, it seems almost definite that sister location is under the Pizzaplex, or at least that's where Cassie finds the scooping room and the elevator. So if that's true, not only does she fall from that height, but then she has to deal with sister location, but now like 30 years later and dilapidated, which does sound really fucking cool. Not to mention, sister location is a very split game. I think the majority of the fandom love the story but don't like the gameplay, but there are some people that defend the gameplay. It's a very heated game, it's a very controversial game, so the idea of being able to do sister location again but like really nail it down is probably pretty tempting as well. So if we're getting anything from the original 7, I think FNAF Sister Location 2 is possible. But let's talk about the elephants in the room. Let's address them. Security Breach 2, Ruin 2, Secret of the Mimic 2. Are we getting any of these sequels? Straight away, I want to say no to Secret of the Mimic 2. I think it's possible, if not likely, that we'll get like some sort of DLC extension to Secret of the Mimic, like an after story kind of thing. But as far as a sequel to it, I don't see that likely. I don't think a sequel makes a lot of sense, especially back to back. The idea of releasing Secret of the Mimic and then Secret of the Mimic 2, that seems unlikely to me. So then we go back to Ruin 2 and Security Breach 2. Ruin 2 is fairly possible in the sense that, we still don't know. Cassie's story ended on a huge cliffhanger, but even besides that, even on top of that, you could feasibly call the DLC to Secret of the Mimic Ruin 2. Because obviously Secret of the Mimic and Security Breach are so inexplicably linked. Inexplicably linked. They're explicitly and inexplicably linked. So the idea that like you'd call Secret of the Mimic's DLC FNAF Ruin 2, fair. But the problem is the naming convention, because we always say FNAF Ruin, but technically I'm 99% certain it's Five Nights at Freddy's Secret of the Mimic Ruin. Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach Ruin. So again, we're talking about titling. I would argue that if we get Five Nights at Freddy's Secret of the Mimic Ruin, that would be Ruin 2. So like, even if it doesn't say Ruin 2, I think it's fair to say we're getting a sequel, a 2. If it's Secret of the Mimic Ruin, I think that's Ruin 2. So I could totally see that. I think that makes a lot of sense. I would not doubt that before we get another major, like big release game, we get a DLC to Secret of the Mimic. I think that does make a lot of sense. To then tell us kind of where the story is headed after. But then, there's the biggest elephant in the room, that's Security Breach 2. And if we get Security Breach 2, I think that has to be our climax. The idea of going back to Security Breach, knowing Ruin, knowing Secret of the Mimic, we can't just be doing Security Breach again. It would be Security Breach because we're at the Pizzaplex again. But like, if we're at the Pizzaplex again, I can't imagine a world where we do that where it's not to fight the Mimic. So if we are talking about Security Breach 2, that's our climax. If we're talking about Ruin 2, that has to be the last rising action at that point. Because, like, what now? You know, I could see what it be, because, like, we're in a very loose state as to what comes next in the timeline. It could be a lot of different things. So I could see Ruin 2 being the way to say what's going to happen next. Much in the idea that it was Help Wanted and Security Breach that introduced Gregory and Vanessa and Glamrock Freddy. It was Ruin that introduces, you know, our two main villains of Cassie and the Mimic, and tells us that, like, whatever they're doing is going to be the problem. Then we get Help Wanted 2 and Seek of the Mimic, which tell us more about Cassie and the Mimic. And then we get Ruin 2. You know, Ruin was the transition from protagonist introductions to antagonist introductions. Ruin 2 could be the transition from rising action to climax, essentially seeing, you know, what they're capable of, seeing what they want to do, and then leaving that there so that the next game is dealing with them trying to do what they want to do. I think that does work. And then, you know, if it is Sister Location 2, I would wager that is another rising action. Because I would think that's, now that Cassie is mind controlled, what is the Mimic and Cassie's plan? Because that is still something that's unclear. Like, what does the Mimic want? It's unclear. You know, when it comes to Secret of the Mimic times, I believe truly the Mimic just wants to play it and, like, be left alone. Because I truly think in its mind that's what it's doing. It's not that it's like animalistic monster that wants to kill everything around it. It's, I was trained off of so much information that it's getting hard to understand what's real anymore. And the last thing I remember is my creator beat me to a pulp. So, like, it's like a violent, scared little creature doing whatever it wants to do. But I would argue, by Security Breach, by Help Wanted, there's definitively an Afton influence over the Mimic. Now, I've said I believe that's because Glitchtrap is M3. It's the third iteration of the Mimic. In other words, I believe that William Afton got his hands on the Mimic schematics that we're going after and used that to create, like, a little third entity of the Mimic to see if he could make it a copy of himself. And, you know, I have a whole video explaining why, but the justification there was that, you know, if William was obsessed with living forever, the idea of a robot that acted and thought exactly like him could always be the backup. You know, if I can't figure out real immortality by the time I die, I'll still live forever in this robot. And I think that's what N3 is, but, you know, that's pretty speculative on my part. But maybe that's what we're getting, right? There's the whole thing of, like, we still don't know for certain what Glitchtrap is. We're not sure what he is, and we might never get an answer for that. But if we're getting a Ruin 2 or a Sister Location 2, I could see both of those being the introduction of and backstory of our final villain, Glitchtrap. You know, the Mimic's form in modern day. Because it is interesting that the Mimic endoskeleton is still there and still seemingly acts like M2, but Glitchtrap exists separately of it. You know, some people think Glitchtrap is Fiona, you know, M1. And that is a fair assumption. You know, it does line up with things she does in Secret of the Mimic. But the idea of her being this yellow rabbit entity, I don't think is just a coincidence. So, I don't know. We'll have to see. But as far as, like, what a sequel would be, the only way it's a climax is if it's Security Breach 2, in my opinion. And even then, it could be Rising Action. If it's Ruin 2, or if it's Sister Location 2, I think it's our last bit of rising action to the plot of the Mimic. And then the next big game after would be the climax where we take on the Mimic. And I really, truly, in my heart of hearts, believe that game is Five Nights at Freddy's Fall Fest. In my heart of hearts, I think the game where we take on the Mimic and end it for good is Five Nights at Freddy's Fall Fest. And, you know, you can quote me on that. You can write it to the bank. And if it is, I'm going to make it now. I've said in the past that, you know, if the games ever directly mention, like, Edwin Murray by name or something like that, I'd do the Stand Is Wrong song dance. And I did. So here's my claim. If not necessarily the next, if one of the next Five Nights at Freddy's games, like within the next 2 or 3, is Five Nights at Freddy's Fall Fest, and it's in that game where we take on the Mimic, I don't know, super chat me $1. I don't know, dude. I don't know. You're not even agreeing to this because you're just watching. I don't know. I get bragging rights forever. I get to never be questioned again. Well, you know what? If I get that prediction right, you all have to watch a video I make that isn't about FNAF. I'll like point you to like one of the Poppy Playtime videos that underperformed, and then you can all watch that as comeuppance for me being right, as I always am, 50% of the time. Because, you know, it's the thing where, like, when I say something, either I'm right or I'm wrong, so it's basically a 50% chance. I think that's all I have to add to this. I'm really excited for it. I just hope we get some kind of tangible news soon, because I think we are going a little stir crazy. And again, it's not that we need a game soon. We don't need a game soon. We need to know where this franchise is going. So just a teaser, not a trailer. It's too soon for a trailer. I would think so anyway. But a teaser, a post that something's getting worked on, anything. And, you know, this is our crumb. Our crumb is that we are working on a sequel. It's a 2 out of 3. That's a good crumb. We can work with that. It'd be cool if it was like actual marketing and not just a comment Scott left in a live stream chat, but whatever, dude. Whatever, dude. Yeah, I think it's time to move on to questions. If you want your questions answered on the podcast, feel free to send them into Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast at gmail.com. That's in the description, copy and paste, because it is a pain to type out. Our first question comes from Tyler, him. What's your thoughts on William Afton's spring locking going from an ironic punishment to a buff/superpower? Like in every continuity, he's jumping around, laughing, talking, throwing out quips, and doing stuff that a corpse in a metal suit should not be able to do, like turning into a 15-foot trash monster in the novels, or controlling the phantoms. Also in the FNAF 2 movie, Golden Freddy Kid says he can't hold him. He's going to be more powerful than ever. Yeah, it's interesting, right? I think if the games stopped at 3 or 4, then the spring lock would have been a really ironic and fitting punishment and death for William Afton. But like even in FNAF 3, he was alive, right? It was one of those things where like, yes, in one hand, it is a good and fitting punishment for him to get spring locked and die. But in the game he's introduced, he is alive and he's able to kill us very easily. He's sneaky, he's fast. So like, I don't know, dude. It is one of those things that like in the game a lot of people, I think, and your question, not to put words in your mouth, but your question belies this as well, because you say going from an ironic punishment to a buff/superpower as if it wasn't always meant to be that way. I mean, you look at FNAF 3 and he can like sprint across your vision depending on the jump scare before he kills you. The idea that post Springlock he's been this barely held together shambling corpse that needs to be dealt with is in canon not right. He not only can run in that first game and kill you easily in that first game, but we burn down the establishment, and in FNAF 3 he's lurking in the background to show that he did survive. So it seems to be that from the start, it was meant to be a sort of buff to him. It was his methods, his research actualized. The punishment is that it didn't work that great, right? The punishment isn't that he's dead. The punishment is that at best he's a stinky robot that cannot function in human society and needs to work on his technique. But at least in the shadows, you know, in the idea of surviving death at all, he was right. So I think, you know, there's this notion in the fandom that when the games were first coming out, that, you know, he was intended to be this fitting, ironic end where he's now just a walking corpse and has to suffer forever and can only hobble around, and that's just not true. It never was. You know, he was always this stronger than life, faster than life creature. But comparing the two, I think it does make sense if you wanted to end the games at 3 or 4 to have that be his end. But, you know, if they're going to continue them at all, you need a more like solidified ending for someone who was dead and is walking around. You can't just have them, you know, you can't just have that it end there because it'll feel inconclusive. So the idea that he's stronger now because of it, I think it makes sense. You know, I mean, small children were killed and they are now physically stronger as these robots. So the idea of like a grown man being killed would also be physically stronger. It makes sense. And it's still a punishment. It still needs to be dealt with. I guess that's my feelings, is that I think it makes sense either way. Depending on how you want to tell your story and the way the story is being told, it makes more sense that he's still around. Yeah, I hope that answered your question. I don't know if it did or not, to be honest with you, because I feel like that was a non-answer, but I hope that was helpful to show my thinking on that. Our next question comes from Skinny, she, her. Hello, I was watching T-Dread's mega compilation video where he went through a bunch of FNAF games with the lens of Secret of the Mimic, looking for imagery. While he was going through Ruin, I realized something interesting and wanted to know your thoughts. In Secret of the Mimic, we go as Arnold, going throughout MCM, destroying the animatronics and characters the Mimic controls. While later in Moon.exe, we almost repair them, or at least help them with their problems, except for Jackie, but she's a freak. It's interesting, though, that we do the same thing in Security Breach, where we go as Gregory throughout the Pizzaplex, wreaking havoc on these characters, while later in Ruin, we as Cassie do as much as we can to help them, except for Monty, because that dude's a freak. First of all, that was really funnily written. That was really, I enjoyed reading that email. But you're right, and I think part of that is the fact that Secret of the Mimic is kind of, in my opinion, what they wanted Security Breach to be. Playing through Secret of the Mimic feels like playing through Security Breach with the lessons that they've learned by making and releasing Security Breach. You know, the structure is, you see in the structure and the themes and the way they approach Secret of the Mimic, the diamond that the rough of Security Breach could have been. The idea of because think about it, both of them really big environments that unlock more aspects of those environments as you play the game. But Security Breach was too big. It was too wide. Same amount of areas, roughly, but it was just too wide. It took too long to get from place to place, and it didn't feel scary because it was so open. Meanwhile, you have Secret of the Mimic, which has, again, many, many areas, but they're condensed. They're tight. You have to weave your way in between stuff. It feels claustrophobic. It feels unsettling. You have, and then there's more to it than that. There's the idea of, you also have the idea, and this is more out there, but I do truly and realistically believe that the way the White Tiger of Secret of the Mimic is handled is how Scott wanted to handle Burn Trap, but he didn't tell them that, right? Like, we know the big issue with Security Breach was that Scott didn't tell them the story, so they just kind of had to guess when adding specific things. But then, we look at Secret of the Mimic, now that Scott is fully telling them what the plan is. And the idea that there's a character that appears in your vision through a couple flickers, and then, we don't see it moving, we just see it in the background. And then near the end of the game, there is an encounter where we have to get past this appearing phantom. Is that not almost exactly how Scott described he wanted Burn Trap to be? Where it was something that you weren't really sure what you were seeing, and it would appear in the background, and it would be flickering in certain areas. And then, near the end, there'd be an encounter with it. It really feels like the White Tiger is what Burn Trap was meant to be, but because of the lack of communication from Scott, it turned into what it turned into. You are right to point out a lot of the similarities between Security Breach, Secret of the Mimic, Ruin, and Moon.exe. That being said, is there a meaningful reason why it's like that? I don't really think so. A part of me thinks that part of Secret of the Mimic was the run back. It was showing them we can do this. We can make a very solid game that was supposed to be Security Breach, but is Secret of the Mimic. But to be fair, I've said it many times, Secret of the Mimic and Security Breach are intrinsically and inexplicably linked. So, maybe there's a reason why patterns keep repeating like this. But I don't think that's an answer we can reach with the evidence we have, personally. But you're right to point that out. And thank you for your question, Skinny. Our next one comes from Spoon, him. Assuming the theory that the FNAF movies having a loose connection to the plot of the Silver Eyes is true, how do you think the third movie might incorporate the elements from the fourth closet? I think the funniest outcome would be an I didn't take your brother, I took you reveal, where movie Michael Afton is the equivalent of the fourth closet's circus baby, as the reason for the unexplained same name. In other words, is Michael Afton Garrett? Or something along those lines. It's interesting. I think they are really rearing up for one of the characters to not be who they thought they were. which is scary because the fact that we've seen Circus Baby means Vanessa might not be Vanessa. It means Michael Afton might not be Michael Afton. It means that Mike Schmidt might not be Mike Schmidt. Because, like, there's still one glaring question in all of this, and that's who the fuck are the Schmidts and why do they matter to William Afton? Because, like, the name Schmidt is incredibly common. The idea that he sees Mike Schmidt and then just knows instantly, this is the family that I stole Garrett from. Why? Why do you know that? Why are you aware of this? And again, every other murder that William Afton does takes place in a Freddy's location. Except for the fact that he went states away to kidnap a child from a campground. There's still no good reason for that unless the Schmidts are meaningful in some way to William Afton. But so far, we don't know. So that has to be somewhere. And I just don't know where. So hopefully we'll see that in the third movie. And that was kind of quick, but I hope that answered your question. And our last one comes from Zoe, she, her. I'm a believer that Rich is our player. So this is about Poppy Playtime. I'm a believer that Rich is our player character, but now I'm theorizing that the unsure scientist in the catnap recording reconditioning video could be our player character. If that's the case, why does Rich have a VHS tape in every single chapter? He's a normal worker in shipping who doesn't seem to know about the experiments. How does he fit in with our story? Your question. Now, this I assume was sent before the second video, because I think the second video shows that same scientist dying. I think that's pretty clear. Some people have argued otherwise, but I think it's pretty clear. So what do we mean by this? In the catnap video, there's two scientists. There's the female scientist who's like, yeah, no, this is our job, and we're working towards something amazing, so whatever we have to do, we'll do it. And then there's the other scientist who's like, but like, they're kids. Yeah. Interestingly enough, his face is never shown. And it's on purpose to the point where, like, there are scenes where they're both facing the camera and her face is visible, but his face is purposefully obscured. So what? Right? Like, what's the deal here? Well, then we get the second video where it's after the hour of joy. Those two are holed up in a closet together for like a week or more, trying to plan their escape before they exit. And then it's revealed that the male scientist there helped the toys escape, not realizing that it would have caused the hour of joy, thinking they would just like escape and go about their lives not being test subjects. So that causes a fight, which draws the attention of the toys, which then leads to them being killed and chased down. Then it ends with our the male scientist, the one who let them free. He's caught by this shadowy creature. We don't know what it is yet. He falls to the ground and then paw over the camera. Video ends. I think that's pretty clear that he's dead. Now, I've seen some people saying, oh, what if that's just the camera? What if he was getting chased with a camera, and then he dropped it, and because to be fair, the rest of the video is diegetic. The rest of the video is like security camera footage. It's body camera footage. But then all of a sudden, we get this chase sequence where we see, when it falls and looking up, you see a paw go over what looks like the camera. Is that a camera he's holding? Two things. One, I don't think so. So I don't think so for two reasons. The first one being, why would he be recording his escape? Man just wants to live. Unless they have body cameras they can't turn off, but that was never established, so we have no reason to believe that. So man is trying to escape. I don't know why he's recording that. But even if you want to suspend your disbelief, if you watch the video, and I promise you this, I slowed it down. If you watch the video, you hear his footsteps when he's running, and then there's the fall, and all you hear is his shaky breath. You don't hear footsteps anymore. If he just dropped the camera and kept going, we should hear footsteps running off into the distance, but we don't. We hear him shakily breathing. For the whole video, mind you, as if he's, still there. So in my opinion, it makes more sense that at that moment, it's his perspective. He was running, he was getting away, and then suddenly he's caught by a large monster. And, if the ending of that video is anything to go by, he's dead. Dead as hell. So I think it's showing us kind of how the escape happened. I don't think it's showing us our protagonist. Now, could our protagonist be somebody else who helped? I think that's very possible. Somebody who knows the location, somebody who knows what's going on. But even then, as much as I would want to say our character, like he, she, whoever knows what's going on, they couldn't have been too deep, because Harley Sawyer makes a point that, like, oh, you worked here, but like, you were never utilized. To imagine someone of your talents is here and we didn't even recognize you. So we couldn't have been that high up, couldn't have been that important to what's going on. So I don't know. It's interesting. It's really interesting. I do think, Rich being our player character does make sense. We've heard about him in every chapter, like you've said. He is being set up as somebody who is sympathetic to the children, has anger issues, but is trying to do the right thing. So him being the prototype or the player are both possible, frankly. But I think timeline-wise, it doesn't make too much sense for him to be the prototype. I could be wrong there. I don't know. The last chapter comes out in like 2 weeks as of recording this. So I'm just jazzed as hell to play it. I cannot wait. I keep saying the last chapter. I don't know if they've definitively said it's the last chapter, but like, I don't know where they go after this. I'm excited. I'm really excited. Yeah. I think that'll do it for today. So again, if you want questions answered on the podcast, feel free to send them into Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast at gmail.com. It's in the description to copy and paste because it is a pain to type out. But until next time, as always, thank you for watching the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast, where the pizza abilities are endless. I hope to enjoy your future patronage. Bye-bye for now.